Hello and welcome to the Delve Deep podcast. I'm your host, Jimmy Wightman, also known as That Meditation Guy. In the following conversation, I'll be talking to Stephen Snyder. I'll tell you more about him in just a minute, but first, let me tell you why I've invited him onto the podcast. I wanted to delve deep into the topic of authentic awakening. There's a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation out there, especially on social media, about what an authentic awakening experience actually is. And I know that because for many years I thought I understood these things. I'd read numerous spiritual books by people like Eckhart Tolle and Adyashanti, and I'd experienced countless powerful shifts in perception during meditation. But it wasn't until early 2023 that I discovered what true awakening really is, when my life as I knew it was changed beyond recognition. I had a massive spontaneous awakening experience during a meditation retreat, and things have never been the same since. So that's what prompted me to bring Stephen Snyder onto the podcast. I'm hoping this conversation will demystify awakening for you, the listener, and also let you know that awakening out of the dream of separation is a genuine possibility for anyone, including you, if you feel inclined to move in that direction. Now, back to Stephen Snyder. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He's a meditation teacher who began practicing in 1976. Stephen is a recognized master of the jhanas, which are the absorption states entered through deep concentration meditation taught by the Buddha. And he's also a Zen master, authorized to teach in both the Soto and Rinzai schools of Zen. So with that said, let's dive in. Hello, Stephen. Welcome to the Delve Deep podcast. I'm really glad to have you here. Thanks for giving up your time to talk to me today. How are you doing? All good?
I'm doing well. Yeah, I'm happy to be here with you and have this, what I think will be an interesting conversation.
Excellent, excellent. So what I would like to do is just jump straight into the deep end and talk about awakening. We're going to go
Okay.
straight there. So in your teaching and your way of thinking about things, what does awakening actually mean for you and your students?
Well, awakening is the experiential return to truly who we are. So it's seeing through conditioned reality of I'm this personality, I'm this physicality, I have all these relationships, to where we penetrate into the unconditioned and have an awakening experience. For my students in my teaching, I'm looking for three components in an awakening experience. The first would be what I call absence of self. Traditionally, we call it no self in the Zen tradition or in Buddhism, which would be a sense of, if I said to you, who are you? Your legitimate, authentic response would be, I have no idea. And normally we would self-reference, I'm this age, I'm this gender, I live here, I went to school here, etc. And none of that's available in absence of self. There's just no sense of who we are at all. Another component is the unity, love. There is an experience of everything is the same fabric of oneness. Everything is in a unity, including me. I'm part of that unity. And then finally, the third component is the recognition, this is my true identity. And we can have any one of those two pieces. People have no self experiences fairly regularly on retreats. The unity experience, same thing, that's definitely experienced on a regular basis. But it's the combination that is really potent. It shifts us out of the sense of self. And then in the Zen tradition, we talk about depth of awakening. Shallow or deep are the two endpoints, the two bookends. And that really depends on how long the sense of self is suspended. It can be minutes, hours, weeks, months. And the longer it is, the longer the self is suspended, the deeper the realization is, because we're functioning from the source, what I call the absolute, for that period of time. And of course, all of us think it's going to be permanent and enlightened forever, and that's not the case. But it does feel that way, and it's so revolutionary. I mean, it really changes so much, but it also requires sustained practice afterwards. We're not done when that happens. That's the beginning of that part of the journey.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. So this is why I wanted to bring you on, really, because 2 years ago, I was on a retreat practicing um, with the question, "Who am I?" And I had one of these experiences that we're talking about now. And it's kind of funny. We were talking about this a little bit before we started. I thought that I was awake. I thought I understood what awakening was before that. So when this happened to me, it was the most surprising, most unbelievable thing. I could never in a million years have guessed that's what awakening was.
Right.
And I try to explain it to people when they ask me, and I'm really at a loss for words, and I can see that they can't really grasp it. So we can, do our best to put this across, but when it happens, it really is an order of experience so far out of anything else in our normal lives that things are never the same again. And so, yeah, that's
Right.
really why I wanted to bring you on, because I want people to hear this and to realize, like, oh, these experiences do happen and they can happen to me, and they really are life-changing. And also, funnily enough, what you just said then about when it does happen, you think it's going to be like that forever. Well, that's exactly how it was. I thought, well, I am now a living Buddha. This is it.
Well, welcome to the club.
And yeah, 3 days later, when the self-referential thinking came back on, and I started to realize, oh, I'm reflecting on the experience as a
Yep.
memory rather
Right.
than just talking from it.
Right.
I realized, oh dear, something's going a bit wrong.
Right. And that's where the shift is. We conceptually frame that experience and then try to return to the concept, thinking it's the same as the experience, which it's not.
Yeah, yeah. And so then for me, what happened was something kicked in that said, oh God, I've got to try and get back there somehow.
Right.
And so that started a sort of mini journey of trying to figure out what to do next, which is actually why I spoke to some people in that post-awakening space where there were two things really. On the one hand, there was a lot of peace and bliss and openness, and it was really, really beautiful. But there was also this sense of I am in uncharted territory. I didn't know what to do because the journey, the path of meditation that I was on had suddenly seemed to come to an end, and I was now in at the beginning of a new journey. And so I spoke to some people who gave me some great advice. Shinzen Young was one of them. And I also reached out to yourself and you gave me some good advice. And how you explained it really stuck with me and has turned out to be true. And I'll remind you what you said to me. You said that, oh, that first awakening is like discovering a new planet. And then after that, further awakenings are like exploring the continents on that new planet. This was the analogy you used, and I thought, oh, that sounds pretty cool. Couldn't really imagine it, but it stuck with me because the question I had at the time was, surely I've arrived. Like, this is it. There's not going to be another. Like, nothing more to discover. It was too big to imagine there could be anything further.
There's no
Um,
sequel.
yeah. But since then, since the speaking to you 2 years ago, I've gone and done another 10 retreats, let's say, something like that. And I've found that actually, after touching into it the first time, you can touch back into it again on different koans and questions.
Right.
But every time I have returned, so to speak, it's hard to explain, but let's use that language. Every time I've touched back into the absolute using different questions, such as what is life or what is this? It's definitely the same absolute. It's the same breakthrough, but it's a completely different flavor and
Right.
a completely different experience, even though it has some things in common with it. And so I'm just wondering, you know, does that just go, could that go on forever with just constantly touching into different parts of the awakening experience through different avenues? And when people use different styles of meditation, not working on questions, but say through concentration, is that giving you different flavors of awakening as well?
Yeah. I'm really happy to hear the advice I gave. And that sounds like good advice. I'd stand behind that today. So that's good. Yeah, there are many vehicles, many paths up the same mountain. And when people have a certain allegiance For example, they say this is the only way, doing the Zen koans, for example, that's the only path to awakening. It's not. It's there are many paths, and none of them, the absolute doesn't have a preference on what path we choose. People will sometimes want me to say that well, like what I'm teaching is better than other people's teaching, and it's just not true. I tell them, well, which is God's favorite tree? And if the absolute doesn't have a favorite tree, how can it have a favorite religion? So all of these work. That's the main thing. As long as people aren't harmed, that's the one disclaimer. If people are being harmed by the process, then that's not a legitimate path. So that's the one thing. In my book, Demystifying Awakening, I lay out the Theravadan map of awakening. There's 4 stages to that. And the Zen awakening, where there's 3 recognized stages. But the reality is that, particularly in the Zen model, awakenings can continue. There was a great Zen master, Hakuin, in Japan, who really organized the koans that we use today, or systematized it more. And he reported that he had 17 major awakenings and hundreds of minor awakenings in his practice life. And that's been my experience, not the number, but the fact is there's lots of experiences. I have students who have probably had 3 or 4 different awakenings at this point, each time going a little deeper or going, as you say, into a new territory of the absolute. And the one mistake people make too with having a first awakening is that we return and try to recreate the first awakening. And I can say I spent years suffering because I tried to do just that. And luckily at some point, somebody who was further along than I was told me, you're never going to have that experience again. You've already illuminated that part. It doesn't need more light. And so that was a big teaching for me. And I try and pass it on to folks because it's a lot of suffering trying to recreate it. But, and in my teaching, we're working also the personal material. At the same time, we're working the transcendent contact. Because when you have an awakening like you're describing, what's going to happen after the awakening is whatever in you is incongruent with that awakening is going to be highlighted. You're going to start seeing behaviors. You're just like, wow, I do not like doing that. That is not, who I am anymore. And so we start revising our behavior too, orienting more towards wholesomeness. In the Zen tradition, that's how and why we use the precepts the way we do. The precepts are considered essential to the path. And so we try to live from the precepts as best we can. I've redrafted the precepts. The typical first precept is do not kill. And I've redrafted, which is a prohibitive precept. I've redrafted them to be generative, which is actually the way the absolute functions is through generative power, let's say. And so like I've reframed the first precept as the precept of preciousness. Because to me, giving a student preciousness as a working, let's say, little koan is a lot juicier than saying do not kill. Because if you want to continue what's precious, you have to identify what's precious to you. And that begins putting you in touch with gratitude and all the good stuff that comes with it. So I think there's ways that we need to work, but in answer to your question, there's no end to the realizations we can have. It's impossible to ever have all the realizations available. The absolute is so mysterious and vast, none of us can ever fully take in the whole of it. It's just too enormous and unending and generatively still continuing.
Mm. Yeah. Well, that sort of is one of the funny things about all this is that I feel like before awakening, I I felt like I had a handle on what all of this spirituality was about. It all just made sense. And now I speak to people and I say, well, I just don't know what's going on anymore. I only know one thing, and that's that I in some form exist in some way.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, then,
Um,
but staying with that not knowing is actually the place to abide, because in the not knowing, every possibility is available. As soon as we start knowing, we're limiting. As soon as we start categorizing and labeling, we limit. So that's why your approach of staying with the not knowing is really, really helpful.
Yeah, that's kind of how I try and go into the retreats, and I just say, okay, for this period of time, I'm just gonna hold this question in a way that I'm open to receive, and that's worked quite well for me. Yeah, and I'm just
Mhm.
wondering, so when you take on a new student, how important is it to get that initial Kensho or Satori? Is it a case that you think, right, we got to really go for this now and get this so that you can, and that's when the journey starts? Or is it you kind of take a more casual attitude and think, well, if it happens, it happens, but if it doesn't, that's also okay. The meditation will still um, give you the benefits that you're looking for.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd say with most people that start with me, new folks, I probably orient people or suggest they orient towards the heart practices, like I have in my book, Buddha's Heart. We all need those. I deal predominantly with Westerners. I don't really have many Asian students. They tend to favor the monastics. I'm a lay teacher. But the Western students really need the heart work. We're basically a society that's very much centered in our head, and we learn not to be as much in contact with the heart because of the pain and the discomfort we experience in life. But we have to go and we have to work on that self. So part of it is doing the heart practices to both mature our relationship to the different categories of beings. We call it people like, friends, benefactors, neutral people, difficult, challenging people, and all beings. And we heal, we upgrade our relationship to these groups of the practices. And we also can use the Brahma Viharas, we call them divine abodes. The heart practices can also open to jhana and even awakening. I've had students have Kensho doing heart practices. So that is a possibility. And they enter through the portal of unity rather than the portal of emptiness or absence of self. So it's less. I mean, a small percentage enter that way. But so that's really important. The other is the anapanasati, the breath awareness meditation I teach, which is the typical vehicle one uses to orient to the jhanas or deep absorption, deep meditative absorption. Because we need good concentration in our meditation. Most of the students that I have who had awakenings, which I'm having an increasing number, I mean, there's a good number of students, most of them have the awakenings through guided meditations I do. And I do these guided meditations where I'm just reporting on the absolute in our field. So what the absolute is presenting in our field is what I'm commenting on. And it works so that I'm a conduit for the absolute. I tell people I don't have any technique or anything I'm doing. I'm just opening to what's here. And it seems to be there's a transmission and a spark where that's where the majority of awakenings happen, is either in the guided meditation or immediately after. And I do also teach koan, formal koan study, and that's a great place for folks to have awakening. And the formal koan study really helps open, develop, shape, make more wholesome our realization. Most everybody's first realization, if we think of realization like this, most people's awakening, there's a part that's really open and gorgeous, and there's another part that's not so much. And so part of what formal koan study does is it helps us sort of knock off the stalactites and stalagmites, and the realization increases, but it gets more supported, more whole. And that's really one of the great benefits of the formal koan study that I found. But let me say one last thing, and that's part of my approach I call the stair-step method, where once people have realization or are preparing to be open to realization, awakening, there is personal material to work. And like I mentioned to you, following any kind of realization, whatever's incongruent will be highlighted. So that's where the work then turns. And when that gets to a resolution, typically we're then open to another realization. We've sort of cleaned up, we've repaired the vessel or increased the stability of the vessel, meaning the self, and we can then go deeper into the absolute for deeper realization.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there. Yeah, that sounds really good. Um, we'll talk about the personal material side about in a moment because this is what your new book is about, and this is also speaks to me personally because this is really where I feel like I am in my own
Yeah.
practice. But just for a moment, I'm interested to go back to this idea of you doing the guided meditations, I assume on retreats for your students, and you're opening to the absolute in that way and then reporting on it. Firstly, this seems like something that I don't come across very often. I've not heard anybody else talking about this really.
Yeah.
And is that basically in your experience of life, as you just go about your daily business, is it always the case that the absolute feels like it's functioning through you at all times? Or do you feel like you have to kind of tune in? I'm just really curious to know about your personal experience as somebody who's been doing this for so long.
Well, in my book, Demystifying Awakening, the Zen awakening, I mentioned the three categories, let's say, of awakening. Now, Kensho is a term we use, which is really a kind of a generic term. We can use it in lieu of awakening. So we could say Kensho meaning somebody's first or their 100th awakening experience. But Kensho typically is a first awakening, which you've described quite well. And subsequent to that, we could have further Kensho, but the next deepest realization, I use the term Satori. In Japan, they use Kensho and Satori pretty interchangeably. I'm using them as sort of a little different gradation, where the Kensho is sort of the I hate to say this, but the generic awakening. And the Satori is a much deeper awakening. And the big shift from Satori is that instead of having the sense of self as our foundation, our true nature, so the qualities of the absolute become where we land. If I say to you, who are you? And you touch in, that's what you're going to find. So it's not the absolute directly, it's the qualities of the absolute embedded in your consciousness from birth. That's what you're recognizing as a truer me. And what happens with the Kensho, I have this thing I call the 50% rule, 51% rule, where it seems as though consciousness needs to have a sufficient awakening. If we say consciousness is 100%, at least 51% of consciousness has to be on board for the awakening in order for it to have the potential to be a Satori experience. And what I see in students, I've had several students who have had Satori experiences I've confirmed, and there's just a kind of a depth that they get to. And when they, even in conversation, when they self-reference, it's not so much coming from the personality, even though there still is a personality structure operating. And then with that, then we begin to work the very deep material. And the most deep material we have to work, I call the core wound. I didn't originate the term, psychology did, but it's the initial wound we all carry. When we're born into a dual unity with the absolute, particularly love and presence. And at some point we realize I need these caregivers in this family to survive. If I don't bond with them, I might not survive. So we elect to turn away from this undivided contact with the absolute and put our allegiance with the birth family and caregivers. All of us take that turn away as a rejection. We don't get, we made the choice to do it. And so we feel like I got thrown out of heaven. And I got thrown out of heaven because there's something wrong with me. There's something broken, something valueless, worthless that can't be fixed. And so most of our personality structuring is meant to show people how we're not the core wound. Look at all the stuff I can do. Look at how successful I am. Look at all the great reasons you want to be friends with me. But after the Satori, we begin to really make more direct contact with the core wound. So the people are working very deep holdings of worthlessness, of failure, being bad, being completely valueless. And we work it with the shikantaza, so we're sitting directly with the absolute. We work it with the heart practices, with tenderness. We accept. We work. I do one-on-ones on Zoom with students and also the public. And that's one of the ways we work it. And it takes a long time. It could take years to work. Some people never complete it. If the core wound is resolved, which it can be, that opens to the realization in Zen called Daigo Tete, which means full or final enlightenment. It isn't actually final or full enlightenment, but the reason it's called that is the sense of self falls away and never returns. So what happens then, mentioned in Kensho, the sense of self is suspended temporarily. In Satori, the sense of self shifts, the foundation shifts to true nature. And in the Daigo Tete, the foundation shifts from true nature to the absolute. So for that individual, whenever they turn in, the absolute is what's contacted. So in answer to your question, mostly when I'm functioning, the absolute is functioning, but it's functioning as this guy in this body with the proclivities and the problems of this body and this mind. So, I'm getting older, I have some health issues. I view it, this is like the car I was issued. Yeah, the bumper's loose, the tire loses air. This is what I got. So it isn't that we're never going to get sick or die, we're not going to have problems in life, but we don't meet them with a personality and the core wound. We come from the absolute. So anyway, long answer to your question, but that kind of lays it out.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. Thank you. It's funny that you use the car analogy just then because I was speaking to a friend recently and I was trying to explain some of this to them and they couldn't really get their head around it. And they said, well, if somebody insults you now, what's the difference between now and before? And I said, well, before, if somebody insulted me, and if it was somebody close to me that I love, let's say, who could land a really personal insult, let, it would have felt almost like I'm really wounded somehow in the body, and I could feel a
Hmm.
real pain and suffering around it. I said, but now, if anybody did, even somebody close to me, luckily I'm in a position where that doesn't really happen, but if it did happen, it's almost like they are insulting my car or something
Hmm.
like that, because I no longer feel this personality is really me. The personality is functioning and it's fine, but if somebody was to insult it, it doesn't really land like the way it used to be,
Hmm.
and things like that. So, yeah, that just came to mind because you were talking about that, and it's
Yeah.
I can really see this in my own experience, and I'm thinking, wow, how far is this going to go? Because after that first awakening, everything just seems to be on steroids now. Meditation is different. The realizations come quicker. And
Hmm.
also, getting to what we were talking about with this personal work, that all seems to be completely different as well. Because um, before the awakening started coming, I just thought, well, I'm just this guy who thinks this way and does this, and I'm just normal, and this is how it is, right? I didn't think of myself as having all of these dysfunctional behaviors. But
Of course we don't.
yeah, once I switched out and experienced what it's like to not be me, but to look at Jimmy from another angle, and then suddenly to be zapped back into being Jimmy again, it's like, oh my God, I had no idea how dysfunctional I was.
Yeah.
And suddenly I can see it all. And
Yeah.
also, I find myself in situations where I will instinctively act in ways that aren't in line with the realization, the level of
Hmm.
realization where I'm at. And so,
Right.
this is exactly what you're talking about. And this is why I was so interested to read your book, because I really now I'm very interested in the personal work and the personality work and the core
Yeah.
wound and all of that,
Right.
because it seems obvious that that is now where the work needs to take place
Right.
in order that I become a more clear window for the absolute or true
Yeah.
nature to shine through.
Yeah. One of the ways you can frame it is that we move from being subjectively grounded in I'm this me, this is all there is, to objective, that sometimes I'm this, after first awakening, sometimes I'm Jimmy and sometimes I'm not Jimmy. And it's the areas that are going to need work that get triggered. That's part of what tells you what needs to be worked. It's not a place to, if that happens, to be lamenting or feeling bad. It's just, okay, well, this is another place for me to work. This is good to know. And this is why people keep a spiritual journal, to watch for anything in life that's incongruent. Overreactions are the ticket. When you see yourself have a reaction, you're like, what was that? Then you can note that down and explore it later to find out the history, where it comes from, the attitude. And the minute you start identifying these things, you see them more clearly and you begin to penetrate. And part of what the new book has, we haven't gotten there yet, but part of it is being with that overreactivity. Say there's anger, being with the anger, feeling it fully, because a lot of spiritual practitioners will bypass. They'll be, if your situation, because you have contact with the absolute, it becomes easy to just go to the absolute when something challenging happens. But we want to stay with what's challenging because that's where the personal work is. So we have to engage that and then continue. And as we unpack that and get to know it, then that becomes potential for being included in realization the next time. So this becomes a really healthy, productive reinforcement of our practice. But you have to get past the idea, I'm done. I'm enlightened. There's nothing further for me to do. That's where problems happen because then the ego starts taking possession of the realization. Oh, look, Jimmy's awake now. Oh, I'm cool, Jimmy now. This is sort of the personality's version of what happened. And you have to resist that too. Wait, no, I'm not special. I'm becoming more and more profoundly ordinary.
Yeah, yeah, that word ordinary has taken on a new meaning for me, I think, over the last year or so. It's the ordinariness of everything that is becoming more and more. It's revealing something that I couldn't see before.
Yeah.
Whereas initially the awakening thing was so transcendent and so wow, and now I'm finding that whatever was discovered in that moment is also right here in the ordinariness all the time. And there's something really beautiful about that.
Yeah.
But let's jump in and talk about the book then. So the book itself is called Liberating the Self, Buddhist Practices for an Authentic Life. And there are three parts to it in the way that I understood it, really. There's the first part, which is revealing and updating, part two, which is called unwinding and releasing, and then part three, which is kind of interspersed throughout the book, which is the student stories, which I particularly enjoyed because one of the things that got me into awakening in the first place was the book, The Three Pillars of Zen. And when I
Right.
read the awakening stories in there, I thought, oh, well, whatever these guys have, that's what I want. So I was drawn towards that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just wondered if we could jump into it and talk about
Sure.
revealing and updating. We already did kind of touch on this with the core wound and things like that and the spiritual journal. But is there anything else that you want to say about that revealing and updating that we haven't covered?
I think in that section there's just I think there's some practices I call foundational practices what are really helpful, and folks can just read that. And there's a couple of the heart practices, equanimity and compassion, that are laid out because those are really essential for the path after awakening. We need to be able, with equanimity, to accept what's happening, the truth of the moment. Most of our human suffering comes from resistance rather than the event itself. So I've got a nail in my foot and I'm really upset, but it's more my reactivity. I'm not going to be able to dance again. I'm going to walk with a limp. I'm going to have surgery. It's going to hurt. So we go into all the story about it rather than just simply accepting this is what's here, and then we have a clarity. And the other is compassion, which is meeting our suffering. We call it dukkha in Buddhism. So it's when we're struggling, having hard things happen, it's letting that be there, really getting closer to it, opens us to the tender love of the absolute, which is compassion. Compassion doesn't take away our suffering. It helps support it so we can meet it. That's really its primary function. And then the second chapter of that section is about working with specific challenging emotions, which I think is really, really important for folks to learn and work, to really understand, things like anger. It's mirroring, or it's a faux quality of the absolute, of strength. And I go through different ones, guilt and envy and other areas. And essentially, it's just staying with that felt sense. Because particularly in Buddhism, there's a lot of people, like I've heard Buddhist teachers say that they never experience hatred or anger. And I just think that's absolutely incorrect. They absolutely do. They just don't acknowledge it. And we have to look at our humanity and say, there are times I'm going to be angry. There are times I'm going to have a hate reaction. And it's not making any kind of standard. It's being willing to just meet what's here. Because as far as I can tell, the personal material continues endlessly because we always have more material in the subconscious and unconscious that as we have deeper realizations, it begins to percolate up when we're ready to work it. So that's unending to me, and realizations are unending also. So there's no finish line. So there's no place to sit and put on your sash. We just keep practicing.
Yeah, this part of working with challenging emotions is really interesting to me because it seems to be a reframe that I'd never considered. I was thinking about it in terms of, oh, if I'm angry or if I'm having these guilt or shame or something, these are essentially things that I can look at and then work out how to eradicate.
Hmm.
But actually, you're giving a different view, which is like actually, if you can understand, you can look at these as distortions of something that's actually good, that is coming from the absolute, that's already innate in consciousness, but is somehow getting distorted as it's coming through the lens of you and your conditioning.
Right.
And so actually, just since reading the book, without even actually going through and doing the exercises, I suddenly realized like, oh, if I do find myself feeling anger or any one of those that are listed in there, I can immediately try to look at what is it a distortion of in the absolute, and just that reframe itself is particularly interesting. Yeah.
Hmm.
And I look forward to sort of looking at these in more detail and actually trying to work through them in the way that you've described. So,
And,
yeah.
and and the first thing is really to simply be with the anger, not to try to manage it, not to try to justify or quantify. Just feel it. Let yourself open to it fully. Now, again, I always have the caveat, we're not looking to act out on this. We're not looking to reveal it to other people. This is for your practice. You need to be able to feel anger or hatred in particular, but all the other different emotions I mentioned in there. And part of it is being with it. And then the exercise is really, what's my history? What's my stories about anger? In my family, anger was not, in my perception, was not possible. We were not allowed to be angry. So as a child, I learned to really use hatred instead, which is a colder, it's less revealing. Hatred can be either cold or hot. And I had the cool hatred, more like the assassin, where I could hate something my parents did or hate them, but I wasn't showing anger. So part of it is feeling fully whatever it is, understanding the history you have with it, the relation. And once you've gotten to that point, then moving forward into the moment preceding the anger reaction, because that's where the interesting work is. That's the vulnerability. Somebody cuts you off in traffic, almost hits your car where it would have been devastating. So your reaction first is survival and fear. And because we don't want to feel fear, fear is powerless. It's without, and there's no strength. We turn to anger, which is a faux strength. You know, we want to swear at the driver and yell things and do all these different things. And if they got pulled over by the police a minute later, we'd be delighted by that. But it isn't actually that we're angry. It's really that we're afraid. And so by being with the vulnerability, that can open up, that's the portal to open up to the authentic quality of the absolute. So I just started working with students doing this who were having, recurrent issues around anger or other issues, and just helping them move to the vulnerability when they were ready. It was interesting how often they would open to the quality of the absolute that is the support for that vulnerability. So that's sort of how it evolved into writing the book.
Yeah, that's fascinating because my normal standard way of working with these things would be to bring in the equanimity on purpose, meaning that I would try and find a third option between being reactive and
Hmm.
suppressing, so that whatever the unpleasant or difficult or heavy emotion is, I would be like, okay, I'm going to give myself permission to fully feel this, to
Hmm.
allow whatever happens, the visual images in the mind, the inner monologue can scream and shout, all of that stuff can go on, and I'm going to feel it fully, but I'm not going to express it or let it take it out on somebody. And I felt like practicing this over the years and becoming, relatively skilled at this, was in itself a level of freedom, a level of emotional freedom, I suppose. But then now there's this extra step that you brought in, which says that if you can experience it fully and understand it deeply, it can even open you up to the absolute as well. And so it's a whole new twist, which is new to me and yeah, absolutely fascinating.
Well, and the cool thing about this is with repeated practice, with each time you had anger, again, fully feeling the anger as fully as you can, and then moving into the vulnerability, abiding in the vulnerability, and opening to that quality of the absolute becomes quicker and quicker each time. And eventually it gets to where, not all the time, I'll never say that, but a good portion of the time, when that, say the traffic example, when that happens and there's fear, the strength of the absolute comes in, or another quality of the absolute comes in rather than going to anger. So we start rewiring, a 2.0 or 3.0 of ourselves where we're having, and this is moving us along the path, that Satori Daigotete path is we're getting closer and closer to getting to the core wound and working that. So, I mean, in fact, we are working the core wound by working that material, but it really changes for people because they're having a more mature response. Somebody's angry at them and acting to them, and they're curious. They're not reactive. They're not defensive. Well, how come you're angry? What did I say exactly that got you triggered? How do you feel it? What does it remind you of? We can have more intelligent conversations rather than just, screw you, which is the normal response, or some form of that.
Yeah. You've given a list of different things that we can work with here. So you've got anger, which is a distortion of authentic strength, weakness and insecurity, a distortion of unconditional support, envy and jealousy, a distortion of empathetic joy, guilt, a distortion of loving kindness, greed and resentment, a distortion of equanimity, and so on. Um, so yeah, I find that this is a really interesting approach. And how is this different to people who think, oh, well, I already do this in therapy?
Yeah, I'm not a therapist. I think that therapy has an important role in a spiritual journey. I know, particularly here in the States, and when I lived in the West Coast in California, doing therapy was very commonplace. If anybody went through a difficult life experience, relationship change, work change, family pressures, they would turn to therapy pretty easily. Other parts of the US and parts of the world are much more reluctant to do therapy. They think it's a sign of some kind of weakness or failure. So I think there's a real role for it in terms of helping us to work with the traumas of life. But, really that helps improve what I call the vessel, which is the the self that holds all of our practice. It helps the vessel get stronger and stronger. So it has a role, but doing practices like in this book also help shore up, repair the vessel as well. And we need that because we need to have a strong vessel to hold the potency of the absolute. And this is why a lot of the deeper realizations aren't really available until you do the personal work, because it would be too much for a lot of personalities to have the intensity and the potency of the absolute when there's these significant cracks.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. I'm thinking about part two of your book, the unwinding and releasing. This
Mhm.
is mainly about lots of different practices. So you've got the shamatha, the 32 body parts, skeleton meditation, kasinas, protective meditations, all of these different practices that you bring in.
Mhm.
And is there a thread that kind of a common thread between them all? Is there a reason why you pick these specific ones together?
Well, most of this is the samatha path, the path of purification of mind of traditional Theravadan Buddhism, which is the original Buddhism. That's what the Buddha practiced. And I'm a teacher both in the Zen and Theravada tradition. The Theravadan practices are really, the samatha in particular, are really helpful practices for the gradual deconstruction of the self. They gradually reintroduce us to what we call no self. And in the Zen tradition, other traditions like you've been in, we're more orienting to the sudden experience. And there's been a long debate in Buddhism, particularly in Zen, about whether the gradual approach, which is the Theravadan approach, or the sudden approach, which normally the Zen is put in that category, which is better. And to me, having done both, they both have value. Some people are attracted to one over the other for whatever reason, and for other people, there's some good combination here, and that's a lot of my teaching. Is I mix and match a lot between the traditions. I tell people I'm not a very traditional teacher because, like, if you were my student working with you, I'd be more interested in figuring out what works for you than I would keeping you on one particular path. So it's really working with people to see. And so my students will do different practices and will do different retreats based on sort of what they need to work on. So I think there's a lot of value to them. And any of the samatha practices of Theravada can also open to awakening or deeper realization as well. That's always the potential when we're working with things that are softening the sense of self. So it's really useful, I think. And like I said, I don't require my students to do things like the 32 body parts and skeleton meditation, but those who are interested, I do offer an ongoing group called Soothing the Longing Heart. We do a day long a month where we do different practices. I teach them, they can't go to the full depth of the practice, but they can at least get to where they can drop below the conceptual. And in meditation, that's really essential that we sit with enough depth that we drop below all of our thoughts and all of our memories and all of our mentalizing around the practice. So we're not making associations if we're in the non-conceptual. We're not comparing it. Oh yeah, when I was 7, this happened. It reminds me of this. None of that's happening. We're simply with the felt sense of the practice beneath all the concepts. And that's where the change starts being affected. So that's the level when I teach, I'm trying to guide people, direct them to learn the practice and then drop below the concept to what's the felt sense of the practice, what's the energy of it.
Yeah, yeah, that's really good. I found that in my own practice actually, is eventually I realized that meditation wasn't just about chilling out and being relaxed, but it was
Not
about
not a bad thing either.
Well, yeah, it certainly is needed for a lot of people, and it's needed for me on some days as well. But then I also realized there was this other side to do with identity and exploring the
Yeah,
nature of self and world. And
right.
it took me a while to realize, like, oh, hang on, I'm actually trying to explore everything in a way that suggests I don't already know what it is. For example, if I'm meditating and I'm listening to the sound of the birds, there was a certain point where I realized that the birds singing is a concept in my mind, and I'm
Yep,
not experiencing birds singing, I'm experiencing sound. So, what is sound? How close and how intimate can I get to this sound? And
right.
funnily enough, it was spending time with that which led to one of these Kensho experiences because
Hmm.
I just got closer and closer and closer, and it sort of lost its thingness, so to speak. It's very
Yeah,
difficult to talk about this. And it's in that moment of pure not knowing and not trying to know what it is, but just being with it as it is, which
yeah.
created this kind of situation where everything just flipped over.
Yeah, and that's exactly that moving away from the thingness, that's dropping below the concept. So you're getting to the raw contact, and then what you did, and the skill is trace the sound back. Where does sound get created? Okay, well, it starts in the ear, then whatever the ear mechanics are, but you trace it through the, the hammer and whatever's in the ear, and eventually you come to the brain. And if you're meeting this without concept, you realize I'm really just comparing this. I mean, really, people say this with food. You try a new meat, and people will say, "Oh, it tastes like chicken," and that's what we're doing is we're homogenizing our experiences. But if you trace back sound to its source, that's where you can have an explosive experience. In fact, my first Kensho, my first awakening was doing just that with all the senses. I was reading a book, the Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch of Zen, Huining, and there's a line in that book, produce the thought that is nowhere supported. And that line just landed. I was about 30, just landed and wedged in me. And I couldn't pick it up or put it down. And so I just meditated like a maniac trying to solve that question. And that ended up to me, well, thought, okay, it comes from sense data. So I tracked all the senses back, touch, taste, sound, smell, etc., to the source. And when I did the last one and they met, there was nothing there. There was no me at the controls. And that's what sparked, which turned out to be a Satori experience, but that's what sparked it. So this is a great practice using sound or any of these things. You see, if you trace it back and if you get past the thingness of it, the concept, that's where it gets really juicy. That's where the good stuff is. And not like we're trying to get there, but we're just trying to put down the thingness of me and the thingness of the object, which is just what you're describing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There was a line in your book which I really loved, and it gave me a little, um, just an insight actually into something I'd been unconsciously, a belief that I unconsciously had, which I hadn't looked at. And so here is the line that was in the book. It says, with repeated contact with the Absolute, we come to know and trust its offerings, which are given without qualifications and never withdrawn. It is always the human who, feeling emotionally rejected by the Absolute, turns away from it. And I read that and I suddenly realized something. I thought, oh, you know what? Every time I go on one of these retreats, I'm hoping to have some kind of awakening. But there's a part of me that thinks, oh, it couldn't happen again. Like as if I'm getting away with something. Like it's too good to be true that this is
Yeah.
actually happening, you know?
Well, but part of what's embedded in there is there's something in me that's not good enough to deserve this.
Yeah.
And that's the core wound. There's a worthlessness in me. The absolute's going to see, oh my God, you? No way. Back of the line, buddy. But that's our fear. You can see we project it on the absolute, but it's not actually there. The absolute is very objective. Like it doesn't like you or me better than the other. It loves and likes indiscriminately all beings. Whether it's a mass murderer or someone we call a saint is irrelevant to the absolute. That's a human conditioned structuring. It doesn't have that same structuring. But yeah, it's this is the thing is approaching is we think that somehow it's not right for us, we don't belong, like you say. In effect, I'm unworthy. That's the message that the self holds, and it's true for the self. That's the point. That's why we feel the truth because it is true until we investigate it.
And it's funny that I even was able to harbor that belief in the face of such obvious evidence to
Repeated
the
experience,
contrary.
right,
Yeah,
right,
because I mean, in all the experiences were powerful, but that very first one, I remember it was almost an overwhelming sense of love and acceptance that was completely without qualification. It was just the most pure, unconditioned love. And it was, funnily enough, I had a conversation with Henry Schuckman, who I know you know
hmm,
because
yeah,
your name came up when we were talking. And I said to Henry, I said, one of the weird things about it was a kind of love that wasn't personal, like a kind of love that didn't really care whether or not I do well in the ups and downs of my daily life. It was just much bigger than that, kind
right,
of love that didn't really care if I had a car crash on the way home. It's not
right.
looking out for me in that way.
Right, right, and that's again where we're projecting a humanity onto the absolute. It's like a parent, and it cares about me, and it doesn't want bad things to happen. Sorry to say, that's not how it works. We're given free will as humans to make our choices and live, and this is our opportunity to recognize and get fed up with the suffering of human life and to turn to something else. What's the deepest reality we can make contact with? And that's really, some of us are born with that question and others stumble on it, and some people never ask it. So it's all, there's a whole range. But yeah, you're quite right. People don't get the objectivity and neutrality of the absolute. If you and I were in a car accident today, the absolute would be like, okay, that's what happened. It's like we were driving, we got distracted, or somebody else did, but that's not an absolute dynamic. It's a human dynamic.
Yeah, yeah. And weirdly, I'm totally fine with that because I've seen the other side, so to speak. And so the fear of death is kind of
Yeah,
there's the fear of death is gone, but then there's also this sense that if I suddenly got a horrible cancer diagnosis, the personality wouldn't like that. And so there'd be this
right.
weird um divided nature of experience where I'm totally fine with it, but also not very happy with it.
Yeah, they'd be fingernail marks on one side, not the other.
Yeah. I've described this experience a bit like this sometimes. I say it feels a bit like um, I'm stood in between two rooms. Like I've got a foot in two different rooms. And one
Right,
room is the infinite room where everything is already perfect and everything is just exactly as it is. And that's all one way. But then there's this foot in this other room where I'm this guy trying to navigate life and make decisions and I figure that over time I just become more and more drawn into the infinite room.
maybe.
Is
We
that
don't
how it
know.
goes, or do you always feel a bit divided like that?
No, there's not much division. There's still times of triggering because there's still, again, unconscious material that's going to get activated. So that's what we watch for as practitioners anytime we're triggered by things. But the triggering is a lot less, and there can be whole days or weeks where there's not triggering. So but it's resting in the absolute, or the absolute is resting as me all the time.
Mm,
So it's a different place to be. I, somebody was a student recently was talking about how much anxiety they have about trying to figure out what people think of them, their opinion of them, and it's something that they loop about and suffer a lot. And I said, wow, that's really interesting. I just, from your commenting, I realized I never think about that. It hasn't occurred to me in years what anybody thinks about me. And if somebody thinks badly of me, it's like, well, that's their opinion. I mean, maybe they're seeing something I'm not seeing. So it's not like it's personal. So it changes also in those ways, which are really helpful. I don't have to sweat performing in any way for you. If you don't like me, or the viewer doesn't like what I say, okay, change the channel. That's your option. But we have to be authentically who we are to the best of our ability in this moment. And that's what practice is too.
Yeah, I guess that's what we are, isn't it? Like an individual expression, each one of us, a
Mhm.
unique expression of the absolute. Yeah.
Absolutely. A beautiful, special, unrepeatable expression. I mean, we're these magnificent works of art, every one of us. I tell my students all the time, you're profoundly special. There will never be a being like you again, ever. You know, you're this wonderful expression of the absolute, this creative and loving, all these great qualities. But, it's always going to be different. If you believe in rebirth, the next lifetime is going to be very different than this lifetime because we're setting up a kind of a momentum with understanding. And these days, when I first had the first Kensho, I had a really hard time finding a teacher to even talk to about it. There were so few teachers that had had awakenings. And today, it's very commonplace. As we've spoken, there are more people who believe they've had an awakening from they've had a transcendent experience or a momentary experience, and they think that they're changed forever, and probably they're not. I had one person come to me and they told me they had a 1 minute Kensho, and I just said, well, it sounds like you had a Kensho from what you're describing, but I wouldn't really claim that. I mean, it's so brief. I can't imagine anything really shifted, and it didn't seem to. So, it all balances out. But just to be a work in progress, and the humility is terribly important. We'll never know everything. We'll never get it all right. We'll never conclude all of the personal material. We'll never reach the end of realization. But that's the exciting part of it. That's the juicy part of it to me, is we're lucky enough to be on this journey. How wonderful is that?
Yeah, yeah. And a moment ago, you just casually dropped in the idea that we have free will. And there's a lot of spiritual teachers out there who suggest that there is no such thing as free will.
Yeah.
This is one of the things that Sam Harris talks about a lot.
Mhm.
And occasionally people bring it up to me and ask me about it. And it's something that I've got no real answer for. And so I just wondered if this is something you get asked about and if you have an answer to the free will question.
Well, from my understanding, the absolute, we're born from the absolute. The power of the absolute, the sort of core of the absolute is the experience of cessation. This is what's necessary in Theravada Buddhism to move along the path of awakening, is to have cessation experience, the ceasing of all mentality and materiality. So it's a lights out experience, incredibly profound. Imagine it's mostly composed of absence of emptiness, peace, and stillness. So it's beautiful peace, profound stillness. So this lovely, lovely experience. There's no self at all, gorgeous, open, free. And this is the potency. This is, when we get close to cessation, there's like a tractor beam feeling. You're getting pulled in and absorbed into cessation. Consciousness and awareness shut off. So but that's the force, that's the power of the absolute. And when that comes through to the love and presence of what I call the manifest absolute, that's where life can happen. So we're this incredible creation. And to me, we're born so that we can walk this path to do what we're doing. This is the reason. And the absolute can only realize itself through form. So it needs us to awaken to itself more and more. And what's great is right now there's such a trajectory of more and more people having awakenings. It's becoming more stable. I have a private theory that when the square root of the human population is awakened, I think that'll be a cataclysmic event. I don't have any evidence or math to back it up. It's just my theory. But one of my students is a retired theoretical physicist, and he sent me these an email with all the numbers of that. He heard me talk about it, and he did the math on it, and said, I think this is theoretically possible, and from a physics perspective. And so then there were all these different things about how many people have been exposed to awakening, whether that group, whether that was the group or just the whole of humanity. Anyway, it was really fun to see that. But anyway, I think it's a great momentum we're on. But we need to do this with intelligence. That's why I've written the books, because I want people to have more information. And also, when I retire and die, I want the lineage to have the documentation the teachers can work with to keep this momentum going that we have of really supporting awakening and people living more wholesome lives, heartfelt lives too, not objective, divorced from our hearts.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, I can really feel that in your work and the way you operate. So yeah, just one more thing I want to ask you about really, which is these awakening stories that you put in the book.
Mhm.
I enjoyed reading
They're
them.
great, aren't they?
Yeah, because as I'm reading it, not only is it fun to kind of it triggers memories of things that have happened to me, but I also feel it a sort of a sense of something waking up in me as I read the story because I can feel that person's excitement and their the shift
Amazement,
that
probably.
yeah, yeah, it sort of really triggers something up in me, emotionally. And so I'm hoping that the more people are exposed to those stories, the more they're going to realize, oh, this is real. This could
Yeah,
happen to me. This isn't just for people who manage to master the jhanas. I can stumble into this, even if I don't consider myself a good virtuoso meditator.
right.
And also recognizing that this is not just something you read about in a book and then decide you're awake. This has to kind of happen to you in a sense.
Yep,
So yeah, I'm hoping that this conversation is going to help people really see the truth of what this is all about.
yep.
Um,
I was really happy with the stories. I had the students write them, and I specifically wanted to include them because I just feel like it really helps people to read. Because you're right, they'll rationalize about me, my experience. Well, you're so and such, so they discount me. But when I'm having students and numerous students having experiences, and you see there's a commonality to the stories, and there's a lot of particularity to that person. That's what's important to know. It isn't generic. Your system wakes up as it is. So it's going to be different. And even there could be cultural differences as well because of the orientation that cultures have in different ways. So yeah, I think they're very potent. That's actually one of my favorite parts of the book are all the stories of awakening. And I hope it does what you say, that people can feel the realness, the authenticity of it, and also feel it as an invitation. You can do this too. It's available to you. If you're, and again, anybody who really has a weak structure, the ego structure is not stable, and they know that. It's really best to start with therapy. Get the structure stable and then come to practice because you don't want to add too much energy into a cracked dish. You jam too much in there, it's going to break further, and we don't want that. We don't want to cause harm. So it's important to recognize when you need some support in that way.
yeah, that's a really good point because when I'm teaching people meditation, in terms of mindfulness, when we move on to the bit where I'm going to start saying, okay, I'm now going to talk about awakening and give you an idea what it is, I say, listen, we're now leaving the mental health stuff behind and we're moving towards something else. And if you're not quite ready for this and your system's not ready for this, then, enjoy the explanations, but don't feel you have to go in this direction because this can make you feel unstable in the short term
Right.
until it does turn around. So yeah, it's really worth mentioning that because a lot of people come to meditation now thinking, oh, I'll get into this because it's good for my insomnia or my anxiety and
Right.
depression. These are the reasons I came into it originally. Never occurred to me in a million years that it would end up here. I just
Whoops.
wanted to sleep better.
Yeah,
Um,
we have the way, there are always innocent ways in. I remember years ago, a friend of mine came to me and had started meditating like you're talking about, and he had been doing about a year, and he said, I'm just trying to decide whether I should really keep doing this or not, because like you, he started for insomnia, and I'm sleeping better and all that. And I said, is anything else happening? Well, yeah, I'm feeling more connected to people, and these people aren't triggering me as much. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And he goes, yeah, I'm just thinking whether I'm done and I should just stop. And I said, doing a meditation practice is sort of like a slide in the park. You start at the top and it's nice and flat, but after about a foot or about a meter, you start to slide down. And the point when you start asking the question, should I be doing this? You're already on the slide. You're past the hump. I said, you don't have a question. You don't have an option anymore. You've already passed that moment of no return. So I said, enjoy the ride. Find a teacher and enjoy the ride. That's my advice.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And something you said a moment ago, it really resonates with me. You were saying no two people wake up in the same way. And I found this out in my own life because when I came back from that first retreat, my wife opened the door, she looked at me, and the first thing she said was, "You're different." I hadn't said anything, I hadn't explained anything. She just looked at me and she felt something, she could see something, and she
Yep.
knew something was a big change had happened. And I tried to explain it, but I couldn't. And also, I was talking from it as well, so I
Yeah. Yeah.
couldn't
You were
really
so
talk.
open.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I couldn't talk in concepts. It was all just big, like, wow stuff. So she decided that she didn't understand what was going on. She didn't know what this was about, but she wanted it too. So
Yeah.
I booked her on a retreat. She went on a retreat, and then she amazingly had her own awakening, but it was very different to mine. If she was here
Yep.
talking about all this, she would say completely different things to what I say,
Right.
because hers was a much more shocking and surprising, mind-blowing in a way, because I'd prepared for it a bit more, I think. So when it
Well, you knew about it
happened,
probably, and she didn't.
yeah, for her, it was a bit like I literally don't know who I am for quite a while. And then it settled down, and it's a couple of years later, and she's
Yep.
integrated now, and it's all fine. But it really was quite destabilizing for a period there.
Yeah, and I do want to jump in and say the you mentioned the integration. Integration and embodiment are incredibly important. So with the students that have awakenings, I really want to slow them down on awakening material at that point. I switch them back to the heart practices in particular, and that will help as the personality stuff. It's like scaffolding around a building. We have an awakening, and the scaffolding opens up the sense of self. And for that period of time, it's open. As it comes back together, which it will do, it sometimes rearranges. And so maybe some parts of the scaffolding will fall away. There's still some ego structure, but it's changed. So part of it is we have to be open with ourselves. And really, it becomes, your koan question, who am I, really becomes a practical question. Who am I now? And I tell people, don't assume you're going to like and dislike familiar things. When you go into the restaurant, really look at the whole menu to decide what you want. Don't just order the same sandwich you always get. Let yourself see the full range. And you might surprise yourself. People have, where they start doing or enjoying things they normally didn't do. So, and for most people, they become better and better partners also. There's less triggering. I had a woman who started meditating with me, and after about 6 months, I said, what are you noticing in your life in your meditation? And she said, well, I'm having all these great benefits. She said, but one thing's interesting. My boyfriend is less of a jerk. And I said, really? I said, has he been meditating too? Well, no. And I said, well, probably your perspective of him has changed and you're getting triggered less. So he seems to be less of a jerk because you're getting more refined. I don't think he's changing at all. At least, not from her meditating. But anyway, so you really can have that. And it does improve relationships. Sometimes relationships do end also, particularly if we're projecting, if we have mommy or daddy projections on our spouse. When we get to a point of maturity in our realization, we don't need the mommy and daddy identity anymore in our life. And then can we be a peer with our partner? And some relationships can't sustain that. There's been a hierarchical imbalance, and the one who's got the superior position doesn't want to give it up. So,
Mm.
we do lose things on the journey, but it's typically things that are now outdated. They're no longer relevant.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I feel incredibly lucky that I'm married to somebody who got interested in this too and then understands it. I can't imagine what it would be like if I carried on down this path and she didn't. So yeah, I feel
Yep.
really lucky in that way. So before we wrap up, I also want to talk to you about a new it's like an audiobook series that you've got out. Is that right?
It's actually an interview series. My teacher and Dharma brother, Mark Sando Minneberg Roshi, and I interviewed, I think, 9 or 10 spiritual teachers and Buddhist teachers, just specifically about awakening. So the series is called Anatomy of Awakening. And in that, we asked them about how they view, define awakening, how do they support it in students, how do they work with things like students in spiritual bypass, what's the role of therapy, all these kinds of questions. And it was fascinating to see and these are all Western teachers, how the Western teachers are letting land the topic of awakening, how they're supporting it, presenting it. It was just riveting. And then at the end, there's 2 sections where Sandra Roshi and I interview each other. So we have our interviews on there too around awakening. And it was fascinating. A couple of the interview subjects are senior Roshis in our lineage, but there's people like Locke Kelly and John Burney from the Adyashanti lineage, Sandra Maitri from the Diamond Heart, Diamond Approach. She's a very senior teacher there. Roger Walsh, who's a professor at UC Davis and a longtime practitioner. Rick Hansen, who's well known in the Neurodharma world, and others. I'm sure I'm forgetting some folks. But it ended up being really interesting, and it's a series people can purchase on my website. The price is $3.99. Right now it's $199 for a limited time, and you get access to all the videos to watch. And the money we're raising is gonna go toward purchasing a retreat center. It's time for us to get our own center, and so I can teach more retreats. So it's for a good cause as well. But it's really fascinating. I'll send you a little clip, a little YouTube clip we're putting out, about a minute summary of the program. But anyway, I've gotten great feedback. People are finding it fascinating, and just seeing all the different approaches, it kind of lets land what's happening in the West.
Right, yeah. And where will the retreat center be located?
I live in Michigan, so it'll probably be here. It's more affordable here, and there's just less activity. There's more nature, so it'll probably be in this area is my expectation. And the size will depend on what we raise. If we raise a more minimal amount, we'll probably buy a large house, and if it's more, we'll probably try to either build or buy a center that can accommodate a few dozen people.
Great, great, amazing. Well, I guess we'll wrap it up then. But I just want to say
Great.
thank you. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate you sharing your wisdom. I've really enjoyed the parts of your teaching that I've come into contact with, and it would be nice if at some point I could make it to one of your retreats. I'd love to
Sure.
experience that.
That'd be
Um,
great.
s-
And I do these I teach the jhanas, like I'm doing retreat Sunday, and then I'll teach the Brahma Viharas, heart practices. And like this year, I'm doing 3 awakening retreats, where that's the focus of the retreat. There's 2 guided meditations a day, and I give a Dharma talk, which will be either on awakening, or it'll be talking about koans or awakening stories from the Zen tradition. So, and the last one I did was a huge number of people had awakenings, whether cessation or Kensho. It was a large percentage of the group. So I'm hoping that this year it repeats. It was unexpected, but very welcome to see so many folks waking up.
Great, great, amazing. All right, well, on that note, we will wrap it up. But thank you very
Great.
much, and I hope to speak to you again in future.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jimmy. Be well.
Cheers. If you enjoyed this conversation, please be sure to subscribe to this channel. You can also follow me on social media if you wish. I'm called That Meditation Guy on Instagram. And you can find out more about meditation courses at delvedeep.com.